lunch provided, but it's 1 hour before the talk. Beth told me, no, sorry, if you feel hungry, next time we'll try to do better. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Almost afternoon, huh? So today, we begin our Quantitative History Lecture series, starting with Professor Clair Z from the University of Washington. Okay. So Claire has been visiting with us for the last 1 month and a half. So before she goes back to Seattle, we invited her to give a talk based on her recent research on new crops and old states, agriculture productivity and state capacity in historical China. So by way of a quick introduction, so Professor Yang has been very productive, especially when it comes to political science or political institutions building history in China. So she teaches in the University of Washington's Business School, but she actually, most of her work is in different areas of political science. Okay, so let me give more time to Professor Yang. Let's welcome Professor Yang. Okay. The format is so Claire, you want to take questions while you talk, or you want to wait until the end?
Maybe I can take questions along the way.
Along the way. Oh, okay. So it's open. You can ask questions in the in this lecture hall, or if you are online, then you can post your questions in the Q&A box. Then Beth will pick the questions from the Q&A box. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. So I woke up this morning at 6 a.m. going to my campus dancing because I'm celebrating the grad friend. It's a sort of campus. And yet we are also the title of the president of the grand campus. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for making the effort and come to the presentation today. I really appreciate that. And I also want to say thank you to Professor Chen Wu and Ma Chen for inviting me here. I'm visiting the Center for Quantitative History for this month, and I have to say this is such a wonderful community. I get to know many people with expertise from various disciplines, and I have already learned a lot. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this. So the presentation today, I've been debating about whether I should present something more polished or something in a more early stage. And then I ended up picking the second option. So what I have here today is a work in progress that is still very early stage, which means that your comments and suggestions would be extremely helpful. So with that, I will get started. So the topic today is new crops and old states. The question that I'm asking here is an old one. So what is the relationship between economic productivity and state building? So, I'm sorry. So in economics, I think we have more or less come to a consensus that state capacity is an important contributor to economic development. But it seems that we know relatively less about what leads to state building in the first place. So the mainstream idea in social sciences, or should I say the conventional theories, seem to paint a picture of a positive relationship. So among those theories, the most famous one is probably the one that concerns the origin of state. So according to this theory, human societies in the early stages, they adopted farming, and then that led to an increase in agricultural productivity, and that led to food surplus, and then eventually to hierarchical states and societies. So this is looking at the very early stage of state formation. And if we shift our attention towards later stage of state development, probably one of the most famous arguments on that is from Tilly. So after reviewing the history of Western European countries, Tilly argued that commercialization and economic development in the 16th and 17th century was a big contributor to the emergence of modern fiscal European states. And then more recently, we have many scholars. So for example, here, Karaman, Pamuk, Archia, and Lee, and Fernandez, they all argued that economic development should be a positive contributor to state building. So in some of the scholars' work, they argue that economic development creates surplus, which can be then exploited by the elite as political rents or mobilized by the states as resources. In either case, it's contributed. And then more recently, we have an alternative view. This new strand of literature is challenging the conventional theories by saying that it is not productivity per se, but the appropriability of the output that enabled the emergence of state. So among these theories, there is one that I call the serial state hypothesis. So for example, in Scott's book, in the book that was written a few years ago, he famously summarized, "It is striking that virtually all classical states were based on grain. History records no cassava states, no sago, no yam, no taro, no breadfruit, or sweet potato states." So why? To answer the question why, we can take a closer look at the comparison between two types of staple food. The first one is cereal grain, and the second is tuber and roots. So those two types of staple food, we can evaluate them on two dimensions. The first one is how easy it is to store and to transport this output. So that is pretty straightforward. The second dimension concerns the information structure. In other words, how transparent the production process is, and how easy it would be for an outsider, say a king or an elite, to get information about the production. So for example, roots and tubers, they tend to be grown underground, and they can be harvested any time of the year, which means that for an outsider, like a king or a tax collector, it would be extremely difficult for them to know how much is being produced, where is being produced, and when they can come in and take the rents. And once harvested, those roots and tubers, such as potatoes and sweet potatoes, they tend to be perishable. So here, perishable is in relative term. I know potatoes, you can store it for a few months if you do it right. But that a few months is probably not enough if the state or some kind of political elites want to utilize as the, say, the payment of a national army. And then in addition to that, sweet potatoes and potatoes, they tend to have very low energy density, which means that it will be very costly to transport them on a per nutrition content sense. So in comparison, cereal grains are exactly the opposite of that. They're grown above ground, and they can be harvested at a specific time of the year, which means that it is easy for an outsider to know how much is being produced, and they can time their visit perfectly.
And then once harvested, cereal grains such as rice and wheat, they can last for years. They also have high energy density, which makes them perfect to transport and to bring back. So because of this, we know that in historical China, especially before the Tang Dynasty, when the usage of money was still not very popular, we have common people frequently reverted to wheat or rice as a form of payment. So here, what we see is that cereal grains, they have at least those two advantages over other type of staple food. And because of these advantages, they are more appropriable. So the word appropriability here refers to how easy it is for an outsider to come and take away my resources and how valuable that would be for him. And some scholars argue that because the cereal grains are more appropriable, they tend to be a more suitable crops for to support a hierarchical society or even a state. So in this paper, the question that I'm asking is a very simple one. Did an increase in agricultural productivity contribute to state building or not? And in order to answer this question, I'm trying to utilize a natural experiment. So we all know that during the 16th and 17th century, crops from America was introduced to the old world. And among those crops, we have maize, so corn, and potatoes and sweet potatoes. So many scholars, including both historians and economists, they have already studied this phenomenon. And the unanimous findings there is that these New World crops had a positive impact on population growth due to improvement in agricultural productivity. So in this paper, I want to take one step further to ask the question, we know that they had a positive impact on productivity. Would this increase in productivity translate into state building or not? So before we dive into the empirical details, I want to walk you through a very, very simple theoretical framework. So this is not a theory paper, but I still think it is helpful at the beginning to have this framework because as you will see, it can help me make a few important points. So for those of you who are not economists, I apologize, please just bear with me for a few minutes. So here, I think this dynamics of state building can be characterized with a bargaining game between a central state and a locality. So the locality produces an output, which is denoted by Y. And then the locality can decide to pay part of that output to the state in the form of tax payment, which I will denote with the letter tau. And then in exchange for this tax payment, the state will provide a service. So if the state and the locality reaches no agreement, then the state will come in and use its force to confiscate the output. So here, to simplify the dynamics, I'm going to assume that the state will always win the war, the conflict. But what matters is that even if the state can easily win the conflict, how much can the state actually confiscate? So in this case, I assume that in this case, I assume that the utility of the state is going to be equal to A times total output. And the parameter A here captures the appropriability of the output. So we can imagine in a Maize economy where everything is so transparent, the state can come in and they can easily take away a great majority of our output. In this case, we will have a large parameter A, for example, 70%. And then in comparison, if we have a potato economy where everything is hidden underground, the state might come in with the most powerful army, but it won't be able to take away much. So in this case, we will have a small parameter A, say 10%. So the parameter A here captures the appropriability of the output. And whatever is not taken away by the state, we assume that the locality consume that. And then if the state and the locality was able to reach an agreement, then this agreement should contain two elements. The first one is the state will provide a public service, which I denote with letter S. And then in return, in exchange for that, the locality pays the tax. And in this case, the state's utility will be the tax revenue minus the cost of providing the public goods. And the utility of the locality is going to be the value of the public goods plus whatever is not taken away by the state. So I think there's not much assumption being made here. I try to keep the assumptions and technicalities at the minimum level. But one thing that we do need to pay attention is this V function over here. This V function captures the value of the public goods. So you might notice that I have two components over there. S represents the level of public goods provision. So if we have more public goods provided, then we will have a better life, higher utility. So that's a pretty standard assumption. What is not standard here is the letter Y. So here, what it shows is that the utility that the locality can get from the public goods, it might depend on the economic development level of the locality. So, for example, if we think about European experience, right? Many scholars argue that those early European states, they engage in, market supporting institutions. They try to promote trade and promote commerce. And because wealthier regions, so more developed regions, they tend to benefit more from trade and commerce. Then we can confidently assume that the value of public goods, the value of state-sponsored public goods would be larger in the regions that are wealthier. So this is not limited to the European experience. For example, Michaelopoulos had a paper on Muslim world in the Middle East, and Jia had a paper on the Muslim trade routes in India. And in both cases, they found that Muslim institutions, they played a role in promoting trade, promoting cross-regional collaborations. And because of that, the value of those Muslim institutions will be higher in regions that are more open to trade. Okay. So in this case, we can probably assume that value of public goods is positively related to the economic development level of a region. But of course, we can also come up with other examples, right? Say ancient Egypt or even China, where the public goods that was provided by the state, if any, it is pretty hard to think about a way that it can relate to economic development or commerce or trade. So what I'm going to do here is I will not make any assumptions about the relationship between public goods value and economic development. I will just leave this function V over there and see how different properties of this V function will shape my prediction. And then we just solve for a Nash bargaining solution here. So as I mentioned earlier, this is not a theory paper. I will not dig into the details. I will just briefly mention two observations here. The first observation is that in this bargaining setting, the tax revenue, the tax payment made by the locality is going to increase in the appropriability of the output, but not the state service. So what this means is that if we can compare a maize economy with a potato economy, then we can expect to see higher tax payment in the maize economy compared to the potato one. But we may not see higher state service. That is because, the appropriability of the output essentially increases the bargaining power of the state. Because I can easily take away your output, then I can, easily demand higher payment from you in the first place. And the state, to some extent, is also a profit maximizing organization. If the state can demand a higher payment without making more effort, the state will do that. So this is the intuition behind this observation. And what this suggests for our empirical investigation is that it is very important to distinguish fiscal capacity and state services. So a lot of research on state capacity, they tend to lump everything into one variable. We have something happen, we see a change in state capacity. But what I'm trying to say here is that you can have different types of states. Some states, they demand high tax payment, but they don't offer much services. So it is important to distinguish the two. And then the second observation is what I called a public goods channel. And for this one, what it meant is that an increase in economic development, so an increase in Y, will only increase our state capacity if and only if the value of your public goods increases with the development level. So this one speaks about the V function that we talked about earlier. If the value of the public goods is unrelated with economic development, then we will not see a positive relationship between the two. And then to link this with our empirical setting, in the empirical investigation, we're going to use the introduction of maize and sweet potato to study the impact on state building. And with maize, we have an increase in total output and also an increase in the appropriability of the output because maize is a cereal. Right? And then based on the prediction of our model, we should expect to see an increase in tax payment, but not necessarily in state service. And for the second one, sweet potato, it is a tuber, which means that it will decrease the appropriability of the output, but at the same time, increase your overall output, overall productivity. So what will that give us? The answer is, it depends. It depends on the relative strength of those two channels. If in reality, the appropriability channel triumphs or dominates the other one, then we should see a decrease in tax revenue. On the other hand, if the public goods channel dominates, we should see an increase. So this is what we should be looking for in the empirical part. And then with that, I think we can start digging into data part. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting that we should take maybe like multiple time periods?
No. It's just if you introduce money and financialization in the picture, then that makes appropriability go to one.
So basically, the locality can sell the potato and pay
Yeah, something like,
formerly.
oh, the state can do that.
Mhm.
And then that will make,
Mhm.
that will change the dynamics
Mhm.
to a more extreme extent. So
Mhm.
maybe you can use that as a way to see
Mhm.
why financialization in human history happened much later.
Mhm.
And also, secondly, you can see silver, when the imperial government
Mhm.
changed taxation from in-kind payments to
Mhm.
just silver payments, right? So
Mhm.
that made your first function very different. So that makes the A go to maybe 0.9 instead of
Right.
1. But
Mhm.
in any case, I think what I'm trying to also say is with an autocratic ruler,
Mhm.
the financialization
Mhm.
of economic output
Mhm.
and also taxation by money, by using money,
Mhm.
will just change the game quite a bit, especially making the power dynamics very different. I mean, you can use today's China as an example to explain what observation 2 really
Mhm.
means.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a wonderful point. So you probably noticed that here what I have is a very simple economy. There's no institution involved. So monetarization, as Professor Chen mentioned, would definitely be an institutional innovation that improves this A parameter. Bureaucratization, on the other hand, I believe is also something that could improve A. Right? You can send out bureaucrats and agents, and they're collecting information about your country and economy all the time, so that the central decision maker will have better information. So, yes, I think those are very important points. I have not introduced them here because my empirical setting is a very simple one. I only studied the introduction of 2 crops. So during that period, I don't think there's any significant change in the institutions. But you're absolutely right. I think this framework, if we apply it to say a longer time span, we will probably need to consider the innovation in institution as well. And I do think that the state promoted monetarization and promoted bureaucratization because they want to have better information. So
for observation 2, right, you can use today's China as a context to keep in mind. So in this case, the value of public goods either does not change with the development level or goes down with the development level. Then what should happen to the first part of the statement?
Yeah. So the second channel is actually a very interesting one. We will turn back to it towards the end of the presentation. And one thing we will see there is that not all states are similar. So we can see this function. It might be positive in some states, but not everyone. So maybe we can come back to that later.
Some people will say the last 40 years of experience on the mainland shows observation 2 it's not valid, right?
I do take the view that in China, public goods does not really increase with development. But that's just my personal view. I need more empirical data to prove that.
And yet there has been economic growth. So that's why some people will say, the second, I mean, this even only if condition is not necessarily supported.
So you're questioning the
it's
even
politically sensitive, so you don't want to talk too much about this.
I'm talking about historical China, by the way. Okay. Yes, so maybe we can come back later to this argument, and when you see the results, we can have a better idea about what is driving the dynamics here. So the data. The most important variable in this study is the adoption of the new world crops. And here I'm studying 2 new crops. sweet potato and maize. So you might notice that I dropped the potato because, based on crop suitability, in China, there's only about 10% of the land that's suitable for potato, which is probably one of the reasons why potato did not had so big a impact on Chinese economy during this period. So this is a consensus that has already been reached by historians, and I'm not making anything new here. I'm just taking their observation, and that helped me to pick sweet potato and maize as the two main crops for study here. So in terms of the diffusion path, there are some debates among historians. So in this paper, I'm gonna rely on local gazetteers to determine the diffusion path. So here, for example, I had a picture of Quanzhou Fuzhi during the Ming Dynasty Wanli period. So in this local gazetteer, there's a section called Wuchan, so local products. And then in this section, there's one part that they talk about vegetables. So they will include everything that is grown, in this region. And then among vegetables, there's one part that mentions sweet potato. So I'm gonna take the first time that a local gazetteer of a specific region mentioned sweet potato or maize as the initial time for adoption. So you might notice that, here the gazetteers, they only mention things that are relatively well established in the locality. So the actual time of adoption will probably be a little bit earlier than the period that I have here. So I agree with that, but this is the best I can do. And then I went over a little bit less than 4,000 gazetteers. Among them, 535 mentioned sweet potato. I believe about 700 mentioned maize. I also compared my data with the data from Chen and James Kwan, and the diffusion pattern there is very similar. So the two maps here shows the diffusion process in China. So the first map here shows the diffusion of maize. And as you can see, maize has 3 entry points. The first one is in northwestern Gansu from the Silk Road. The second one is in Yunnan from India and Myanmar. And the third one is in Guangdong from overseas travelers. And then for a sweet potato, I have 2 entry points, one in Guangdong from Vietnam, one in Jiangsu from Philippines. So there is some debates here. For example, for sweet potato, there is one mentioning of it in Yunnan Tongzhi during the Ming Dynasty. So this is the reason why some historians believe that sweet potato has 3 entry points. It was also introduced to Yunnan from India and Myanmar. But unfortunately, that mention did not give any specific location or any specific time for adoption. So because of that, I dropped out that observation and I ended up with only 2 entry points. So to account for this issue, I'm gonna both include and exclude Yunnan province during the later analysis, and the results are very similar. And then here you probably notice that sweet potato has an early entry in Jiangsu, but it did not spread out in that region. And the reason, of course, is because the adoption of those new crops will be correlated with land suitability. So here I have 2 maps showing the crop suitability for those 2 kinds. The first one shows this crop suitability index for maize. And you can see that, a great portion of regions in North and Central China are very suitable for maize. Whereas for sweet potato, the lands that are most suitable for it are primarily in the south. So the suitability index that I have here is from this FOA database. It is pretty standard. What is interesting is that this database offers 3 sets of variables. The first one considers only climatic factors. The second considers climate and land properties. And the third one also considers human inputs. So for the main analysis here, I'm going to use the second category, but I'm going to include all the others as robustness checks. So 2 dimensions of state capacity. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to distinguish between fiscal revenue and administrative capacities. So for fiscal revenue, I'm going to use taxation data from Liang Fengzhong, and I will try my best to convert taxes that are paid in kind into silver. And then for administrative capacities, I'm going to use the density of county and prefectural seats, and a data set on walled city area from this China city wall area data sets. So for this particular city wall area data set, it is based on both archaeological evidence and historical archives. They essentially try to reconstruct the city map for towns and cities in late imperial China and calculate how much area is enclosed by those city walls. So I'm using it as a measurement for administrative capacity, but not urbanization, because in late imperial period, we have market towns and all kinds of urban centers that are emerging outside of those city walls. This city walls, I believe, is more closely related to the administrative capacity of the state rather than urbanization. And then I have a bunch of supplemental data sets. Most of them are used as control variables. So the method I'm going to use is a staggered difference in difference. I am using 2 approaches, so I hope that's a familiar phrase. For the first one, I'm going to use the actual adoption as the event of treatment. And then we know that different regions have different levels of land suitability. So I'm going to use that as a continuous measurement for the intensity of treatment. So essentially, I'm regressing a variable of state capacity on a dummy variable, which equals to 1 if a region adopted maize or potato, and that what times the land suitability in that area. So one concern with this approach is that the actual adoption might be driven by some other factors. So to address that, I'm going to use a second approach, which uses a common cutoff time for all regions. So the dummy variable here will be equal to 1 in after year 1600 for all regions, no matter they adopted maize or not. So this is to address the concern that the adoption might be driven by omitted variables. This is, yes. To use land suitability. Actually, yes, I am trying to do that. I haven't done it yet because I feel like this setting is more straightforward because you can see like before and after. Whereas the IV case, it is certainly doable, but I just feel like the results is less intuitive.
Okay. Sorry, but a second point, since we're talking about this, is in the map, right? It's quite clear that there's a regional variation, right?
Right.
North is better for maize, south is better for sweet potato.
Right.
So in any case, whether or not it's an IV or DID, you might potentially be picking up just regional variation, right? In other predetermined.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. So I'm trying to address that by 2 ways. The first one, I will include a regional fixed effect as well as a regional time trend. So hopefully that will help me to pick up some of those north and south differences. And as a second approach, I also in the robustness check use a comparison between maize and potato. So maize and potato their suitability index actually overlaps a lot. So there, the hope is that it's not going to be driven by, mega regional differences, but will be like smaller. So this is the main table here. Column 1 is kind of a placebo test. So here I'm looking at the impact of those new crops on population density. So the goal of this column is just to make sure that I am in line with existing literature, that my data is not some like crazy outliers. And that was true. So we see that both crops increased population growth. But what is interesting is they had different impact on state capacity, and in here, fiscal capacity. So this model includes a bunch of permutations. I have them over here. So we have, provincial trend, spatial correlation, dynamic lagged terms to account for history dependence. I also include a bunch of controls. So distance to war, distance to major road networks, because, access to trade might be one concern here. And also distance to treaty ports, because the influence of Western colonialism might also be a concern here. So I try to include a bunch of controls to address this. And the data pattern was very consistent throughout all these mutations. And that is, we have maize, increasing fiscal capacity, but sweet potato decrease. And then we take a look at administrative capacity. So, yes.
Low level.
Sorry about that. So for the main results here, I use grid cell of 2 degree times 2 degree. In the robustness checks, I use for administrative capacity, I use prefectural level. For tax, I use provincial level.
So you are using a grid cell. So how to bring down the tax data to the different grid cells? I believe the Liang Fenzhu's data is, more of the data is on the provincial level.
Right, the tax revenue data is on provincial level. So essentially, I do a weighted average. So if a grid cell overlaps with the provincial boundary, and then I calculate the average tax payment in that overlap region, and then I do a grid cell level weighted average.
It seems to be a little bit strong assumption about this implement of the data here. And another thing, in the mean and teens period, I believe this overlapped most of the period you analyze that the taxation is more about the quota systems. So the tax data is not about the revenue, it's about the quota they allocate, and the quota could be fixed for a very long time. So it's in the Qing dynasty, the land tax revenue quota is almost fixed in the entire dynasty. So so it's I think that could be captured different things. One thing is could be whether the states raise the tax quota. Another thing is whether they really collected much revenue like that.
So that's a very good point. 2 answers. The first one is I only use the grid cell as a unit of observation in the main results. In the robustness check, I use provincial boundaries. The reason is because the other data that I have, they are not at a provincial level, right? So I want to utilize the variation in my data set to the extent. And then a second point, you mentioned that, in the Qing dynasty, we have this transition tending rule, right? The promise from the Qing government is that the taxation will not grow with population starting from mid-18th century. So my argument, so not an argument, but my thoughts on that is that this precisely reflects the state's attitude towards taxation. Because, first of all, the central government, when they issue this policy, it takes several hundred years for the local counties to actually implement it. You can see this in the gazetteers, right? The policy was first proposed during the Yongjing period, but even towards the late 19th century, some prefecture gazetteers are still talking about this new policy and how they can implement it. So the implementation is not one thing. It is not only one thing, but it also includes a lot of regional variations. And this regional variations, we do not have explicit documentation to explain this regional variations. But I believe one factor that might influence it is the local government's incentive to collect more tax. So all of that, yeah. Will that help answer your question? Yes.
Actually, there are many different versions of the local gazetteer in Minqing dynasty. So maybe you can select the text from the different versions to calculate if the amount of the text is different among different time period. And another thing is, I think, the North China is poorer than the South. So it's reasonable that the North China have few money to update the local gazetteer. So normally the North China have fewer version of local gazetteer. So if you collect the data, the time of the maize from gazetteer, how do you consider this variation across the geographical region and the time period?
That is a very good point. I don't have a good answer to that. I also noticed that wealthier regions tend to have, as you mentioned, more frequent updating in their gazetteers. So the timing of the initial adoption might be more precise in the wealthier regions. I don't have any way to address that. Yeah. So maybe someone can help me to come up with some ideas. Yes.
Okay, I just have one clarification question. So what is the time horizon of your panel data set?
Time horizon 50 years.
Yeah, 50 years, starting from which period and end by which period?
Starting from 1300 till 1900.
1900.
Yes.
Okay. And what does the wall area here mean? Is it a military institution or something?
This refers to the walled city area data set that I mentioned earlier. So they're calculating the size of those walled cities, and then I'm aggregating that at the grid cell level. So in this grid cell, what is the portion of regions that are inside a wall?
Okay, so what kind of functions or what types of state capacity did the wall area here capture?
Oh, so most of these walled areas are cities or towns. They tend to be cities and towns set up by the state. So for example, market towns or 集市, they are usually not inside the city walls. These city walls are administrative centers. I have some variations of this variable. So sometimes I include military garrisons, sometimes I don't. But you can kind of think of it as the size of the administrative centers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So with the two outcome variables you are using, one is the administrative capacity, the other is the fiscal capacity. Right? I mean, both of them don't really capture what you want to capture, that is real state capacity that concerns people's lives, right? So, I mean, administrative capacity really just focuses on the bureaucratic structure. So the bureaucracy can be very extensive, does not mean that it actually provides state capacity for people. I mean, for the larger society or for economic development. And then the fiscal capacity, I mean, many people would have a very big issue with that. I mean, you could have a very expropriating irresponsible government just to take income away from people. And that, of course, that would make the fiscal number very, very big. But actually, that's not a reflection of state capacity. It just reflects the power of the state to take people's income and assets away. So, I mean, I would use some more direct outcomes. For example, like in some of our papers, we use like violence, the level of violence, right? Like homicide rate. And things like that. That should really capture what really matters when we talk about state capacity. My understanding is that the term state capacity has a lot of implicit connotation behind it, which means, which is, it's something good for the larger society. It's not just something good for the rulers.
Right.
For the ruling class. We really mean state capacity in terms of what is good for the population. Right? It's not just what is good for the powerful bureaucrats.
Right.
So what you're using here, the both of the variables are really from the perspective of the powerful bureaucrats, for their personal interests. Yes, these two variables do capture.
So yeah, thank you for the question. That actually speaks to one of the things that I was trying to capture here, right? So as I mentioned earlier, there are different kinds of states. Some of them are more extractive than the others. So the reason that I have two categories, with one being fiscal revenue, is that I want to distinguish states that takes a lot of money but do nothing from the other states that provide higher public goods. So that is a very important thing. But I can see your concern here, and I also share this concern, is that the argument that I have here for using administrative capacity is because, in a historical setting, you need to have some kind of state presence, to have an office, to have an army, have, the administrative capacity to provide public goods. So I think this variable would be related to state service. But I totally agree with that in order to fully distinguish the resource being taken versus the service being offered, it would be better if I can have a variable that captures directly the kind of service that is offered. So one thing that I'm currently doing is on irrigation projects, so that, but the problem there is, the data on that tends to be not so good for the period that I'm studying. And then I also had some suggestion from other people about various state agencies, like, not just tax collector, but office for contract resolvent and different state offices. Again, there is this issue that the location of those offices is very strong correlates with administrative centers. They only set up those offices inside the city walls. So I'm still having this problem. I don't seem to be able to get a perfect variable to measure what I want to measure, which is service being offered to the citizens. For war and homicide value, I feel like there might be too many things get involved there. It's not just the state maintain order, but also what is the extent of state-locality conflicts. And in some regions, there's also the minority issue. So I haven't found a good way to tease out all those variables. So all of that is to answer that I think there is some reason for using this variable, but I am still trying very hard to get a perfect measure for what I want to capture.
Yeah, both variables that you have now capture more of the capacity to extract from the people. not, not so, I mean, if we use today's China as an example, both of these variables would take a very high value for today's China.
I would probably disagree on that because I do think administrative capacity is also related to the extent of service offered, especially because some version of these variables also include military garrisons. So it might be true that sometimes the state use military for coercion and suppression, but that seemed to be more related to national defense. And also, a lot of the function of the state, the set up offices inside these administrative centers. So on that dimension, I think it captures the extent of service. So I think I'm running out of time. I'm just gonna skip. Okay, so I want to mention briefly about this mechanism part. So in order to understand why sweet potato, especially sweet potato, has a negative impact on state capacity, I try to look at its impact on urbanization. So urbanization is often closely related to state capacity. In China, urban area are usually closely managed by the state. So for example, the city walls are constructed and maintained by the state. And also urban area provide available tax resources. I know that we have this impression that, historical Chinese dynasties, they tend to rely more on agricultural tax than commercial tax. But if you look at the dynastic circles, what happens is that, even some dynasties rely more or less on commercial tax, they always come back to commercial tax towards the end of the dynasty. So the portion of state revenue that comes from commerce-related activities is going to grow towards the end at a time when the fiscal burden on the state was heavier. So we believe that this speaks, to the importance of urban area as a valuable tax source. And then if we agree on this, then we can kind of consider the urban area as a place where the presence of state is stronger than the areas outside. So if we focus on this urban area and the pattern of population inflow versus outflow can kind of help us shed some light on the bottom-up attitudes towards the state. So basically, do the ordinary people, do they want to live in the state or do they not? Okay. The data on urbanization come from different sources. Some of them are based on cities. So I do have the specific location of those urban communities, and some of them are at macro level estimations. So for just to briefly summarize, what I have here is that with all different measures of urbanization, it seems like that maize does not have a significant impact on urbanization, but potato decreased urbanization. Okay. So when I first look at this result, that actually reminds me of a personal story. My grandma, she grew up in Hunan near the Dongting Lake. So that was a region that was famous for agricultural productivity, right? We call it the land of fish and rice. And I noticed that she never eats sweet potato and fish. So I asked her, like, why? And she told me it was because that she has had too much of that during the famine years. So sweet potato, I can understand. But I was very surprised to hear that she had had too much fish because, you think of fish as high protein, low fat, like super healthy food, and definitely not easy to produce. So I was very surprised and I asked her why. And she said that was because, she lived near the lake. So all the crops or vegetables that they grow in the local production team, they have a quota from the state. They have to turn it in. That was during the Great Leap Forward period. But then whenever they run out of food, they can just sneak out in the middle of the night to find a local river or a wetland, and they can always catch something there. So she has had a lot of fish and sometimes even turtle and clawfish, but they can always find something there. So this story, I think it shows that, sweet potato, or in my grandma's case, fish, these are products that are not closely, at least in this case, they're not closely monitored by the state. And the presence of those wild fish and sweet potato gave her an option to live, at least temporarily, outside the state system. So I have a quote here, and I apologize that I forgot where I got this quote, but it says that walls were built to keep enemies out, as well as keeping its own citizens in. So what is interesting in this case, if we compare the result that I have here with, say, for example, Nan and Qian's paper, where they identified a positive impact of sweet potato on urbanization, the story that I have here is the exact opposite. Their story was that in Europe, because of potatoes, they have higher population growth, and then they have more able-bodied young people. They migrate into the cities and look for better jobs, and they work in factories and all that. And all of that help increase the urban population. But what I have here seems to suggest that with the option of sweet potatoes, people are moving out of the urban areas. So this goes back to Professor Chen's earlier points that not all state capacities are equal, because in Asmoglu and Robinson's term, we can have extractive versus inclusive states. And in Tilley's terminology, we can have states that engage in capital strategy. So they try to attract resources, they try to promote economic development. And we can also have states that engage more in coercion strategies. So it is important to distinguish those two types of states. And then economic development might have a non-monotone relationship, non-monotone impact on state capacity, not only because the economic development could be brought in by different technologies, which changes the appropriability of the output in different ways, but also because the state will be different and the type of public goods offered will be different. So to summarize, I am a little bit over time here. So just to summarize here, I used the introduction of new world crops to China as a natural experiment. I found a non-monotone relationship between development and state building. And lastly, this is a question that came to me during this research, is that if cereal is such a good crop to support state building, then would the state play a role in promoting it? So we do have some anecdotal evidence. Right? For example, champa rice was introduced to China during the 10th century, and we see that the national government, Song Dynasty, played a very important role in its promotion. And then worldwide, we also know as a fact that when human society transitioned from hunter-gatherers to more hierarchical structures, our diet changed. The diversity of our diet dropped. We used to eat a lot of fish and vegetables and fruits and nuts. And then when we transitioned into state, everyone eats rice or wheat or other cereals. So we do have some evidence here, but again, there's no definitive proof on that. And that I think that would be a very interesting question. So that's all I have today. Thank you very much again. And I guess we'll go.
Okay, any questions? Gunther, you're smiling. Okay, good. Okay. Oh yeah, thank you, Claire. Oh.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm still quite confusing about what's the state capacity here. That there's a difference between the region where produce the crops and the region where maintains the troops. at least during the Qing Dynasty, because you know the location of the troops is served not only for the maintenance, but also for defending the country from the barbarian or something. But the corpse or the grains or potatoes are always be collected from the wells area and transported to the area where contains the troops. So I'm curious that how to could it be just a regression then for such two kind of areas to get some kind of relationships or outcomes? I'm curious about that.
Oh, that's a very good suggestion. So you're suggesting I can look at only military garrisons as a Y variable. Is that?
Yeah, somehow, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Currently, I have administrative centers, both excluding military purpose places and also including them. And the results there was it was pretty similar. Yeah, that's a good point. I can probably look into that.
In Qing Dynasty, actually, there are some people in the cities who are in charge of when there is a fair, then there is a station. Some people go to go to prevent the fair and but in Mingqing, actually, such people or guide, such an institution disappeared. So maybe it's a reflection of the state capacity.
That's a good point. I did not include the Song Dynasty here in the analysis. So most of it are just Mingqing. But are you suggesting that the function of the urban area might be different moving from Song Dynasty to Mingqing period? Yes. So a short answer to that is I did not include Song Dynasty here. Mhm.
You can reach from the screen or on your screen there. The first one is related to the model part. What is the empirical basis of society for this theory? And then the second question is, what is the source for tax collection? And then the third one, what are you using the walled area to do? What kind of state capacity is it supposed to represent? Yeah, we talked about this earlier. Then lastly, what type of public goods and services are you thinking of? Many of the things you name are not state services, but rather of the locality, such as irrigation projects, the works of local elites. Yeah.
So maybe I can start with the last question here. So the last one, what type of public goods are you thinking of? So, you know, I also, this is a question that I've been thinking a lot about throughout several projects that I'm working on. How can we decide, you know, what are the services provided by especially historical states? So my current understanding of this issue is that the number one is going to be national defense. But as you probably, for those of you who know China well, you can easily think of national defense as not a local public goods. It's going to be a national level public goods. And the empirical setting that I have here is talking about spatial distribution within the state. So I'm not considering public goods that are provided at the national level. Right. So to answer that, I think national defense is a very important public goods, but it may not fit with the empirical setting that I have here, which talks about regional differences. And then irrigation, true, a lot of irrigation projects are provided by the locality, but some of that, such as, the Yellow River, most famous example, are orchestrated by the states. And then additional examples might be, the major road networks and the post system. They are usually maintained by the state. So they mostly serve a function for the state in terms of managing information and all that. But they, you can also think of it as a kind of a state services. So that's, are those new questions?
At the bottom, there are two new, yeah. Maybe famine relief could be an example, as Gallagher, Maccabee pointed out. Yeah.
Right. I've been trying to think about famine relief. So the data set that I currently have seem to be famine relief programs that are organized by the locality. So I do know some examples of state-sponsored famine relief programs, but for that, I do not have systematic data on that. And I don't know if the state engaged in any kind of systematic program for that one.
Yeah, Carol Shu has
Mhm.
like 2 or 3 papers on
Mhm.
this,
Right.
Using data from the 18th and 19th century. So
Okay,
you
yeah,
may
yeah.
check that out.
I should definitely check into that. Follow-up potential question.
Yeah, I think we should stop soon, so. Okay, yeah, no, so Kai Chen, yeah, no agreement entailed to be confiscated. Seems to be a very strong assumption, which supposes, yeah, I mean, you can all read it from the screen. Yeah.
Okay, so I agree, this is a very strong assumption. I'm making this assumption because 2 things. One is to have a simple model, and second, because this assumption is usually lifted if the researcher want to talk about the trade-off between national state versus local elites or self-organized local institutions. And here I am not talking about local institutions at all. So which is why in the framework I live out this, I made this assumption. So I think this comment is trying to point out one potential missing variable here, that is local uprising, and how that is going to respond to changes in state capacity. So I think that is a very important issue, especially if we move into periods when the state has a relatively weaker capacity or more decentralized periods. But in here, because I'm focusing on Mingqing period, there's always this very strong central state and presence. I think this, of course, the dynamics, there are many things we can consider, but at the bottom level, if we simplified it into a confiscation versus agreement scenario, I think we can still capture some of the dynamics, especially the dynamics that I'm trying to use for the empirical setting. So I agree with this comment that local uprising is important, but I don't think it will change the dynamics dramatically here.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Claire. I'm very impressed that you could actually stand up in front of a big audience and think at the same time. Usually I cannot function like that. So when I stand in front of people, my brain just shuts off. So you have shown that you have the capacity to do that, so, which I don't. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for sharing your work with us. Understand that there's more work to do. So this is also why, events like this can really help both the presenter and the audience think about the deeper research questions. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's end here. Okay, so next Thursday we will have how about next Thursday, right? Okay. So on October 19th, well, 1 month from now, we'll have another event. Okay, so see you next time. Okay.